63 men stood in that memorial hall. Not one of them breathed too loud. Not one of them looked up. Because at the front of the room, standing alone beside the casket, was Kang Seo-jin, the man they called the Stillwater, the youngest syndicate leader in Seoul's modern history, and the only man in that room who could end careers, bloodlines, and legacies with a single phone call. His own security chief later testified that in 12 years of service, he had never seen anyone voluntarily step within arm's reach of Seo-jin uninvited. Until that Tuesday. A 5-year-old black girl in a white dress walked straight through the silence. 63 men held their breath. She didn't stop. She didn't bow. She reached up and took his hand. Now here's what nobody in that room understood yet. That little girl's mother had been receiving sealed monthly envelopes from Seo-jin's dead father for exactly 4 years and 7 months. 55 payments, no return address, no explanation. And Seo-jin? He didn't know a single thing about it, but he was about to. If you want to see how a man who controlled half of Seoul's underground got completely undone by a woman who wouldn't even let him past her front door, subscribe to A Korean Mafia Boss right now. Because what happens next? Nobody in that funeral hall saw it coming. So the question is, why was a dead crime lord secretly sending money to a little girl he'd never met? The memorial hall in Gangnam-gu smelled of white chrysanthemums and cold marble. Rows of men in identical black suits stood with their heads bowed, not in grief, but in calculation. Every person in that room was measuring the same thing, what Kang Seo-jin's mood would be today, and how far from him they should stand. Seo-jin was 34, tall, a jaw that looked carved from stone, and eyes that gave away nothing. Not sorrow, not anger, not the fact that he hadn't slept in 3 days. He stood at the front of the hall beside his father's portrait, hands clasped behind his back, perfectly still. His father, Kang Mi-young-ho, had built the Kang organization over 40 years. Real estate, import-export, private security. And beneath all of that, a network so deeply embedded in Seoul's financial arteries that dismantling it would crash half the city's commercial districts. The old man had been ruthless, efficient, and now he was dead. Heart failure, the doctor said. 68 years old, 40 of them spent running an empire, and his heart just stopped. But here's the thing, no one at that funeral dared to say out loud. Seo-jin hadn't spoken to his father in over 2 years. Not one phone call, not one meeting. The reason? Nobody knew, and nobody was stupid enough to ask. Hwang Tae-sung stood near the third row, watching. He was 51, silver-haired, and had been the Kang organization's chief financial strategist for over a decade. He was the man who laundered legacies into legitimacy. He was also the man who believed, fully, quietly, dangerously, that Seo-jin was too young, too cold, and too emotionally fractured to lead. Tae-sung didn't want the seat. He wanted the influence, and funerals, he knew, were where influence shifted. The ceremony proceeded in silence. A monk chanted. Incense curled toward the ceiling. No one moved. And then, from the back of the hall, something shifted. A woman appeared in the doorway. She was tall, dark-skinned, dressed in simple black, not the designer mourning of the wives and daughters around her. She held the hand of a small girl, maybe 5 years old, in a white dress with tiny braids pulled back from her face. Several heads turned, whispers rippled. A black woman at a Kang funeral? No one recognized her. No one knew her name. And in a room where everyone was cataloged, connected, and controlled, an unknown face was a threat. But nobody stopped her, because nobody wanted to be the one to make a scene. The woman found a seat near the back. She held the girl close. Her face was composed, not nervous, not performative. She simply sat. But what happened next changed everything. The little girl looked toward the front of the room. She saw the man standing alone, and something in her face, some gravity that children sometimes carry without knowing, made her slide off the chair. The mother reached for her. Missed. The girl walked. 63 men watched a 5-year-old child walk straight up the center aisle, past the monks, past the incense, past the men who hadn't dared to cross that invisible perimeter around Seo Jin in years. She stopped right next to him. She looked up, and then she reached up and wrapped her small fingers around his hand. The room didn't gasp. It was worse than that. The room forgot how to function. Seo Jin looked down, and for the first time in anyone's memory, his expression cracked. Just barely. Just enough. His jaw tightened. His eyes changed. Not soft. Not yet. But something behind the glass wall of his face shifted, like a foundation giving way beneath a building that everyone assumed was unbreakable. He didn't pull away. He didn't speak. He just stood there, with a child's hand in his, while the most powerful men in Seoul watched and understood nothing. Within 2 hours of the funeral ending, Seo Jin was in his private office on the 46th floor of the Kang Tower in Yeouido. His right-hand man, Director No, stood across the desk. "Find out who she is," Seo Jin said. His voice was the same flat frequency it always was. If the funeral had affected him, nothing in his posture admitted it. The woman. The child. "I want names, addresses, and the reason they were on that guest list by morning." Director No hesitated. "Sir, the guest list was compiled by your father's personal secretary before his death. It was sealed." "Then unseal it." By the next morning, Seo Jin had a file. The woman's name was Amara Okafor, 30 years old, Nigerian-American. She'd moved to Seoul 6 years ago on an international development grant and stayed. She ran a small nonprofit in Mapo-gu called Bit Nara, Shining Country, a community center that provided after-school care, language tutoring, and cultural integration support for children of mixed race and immigrant families in Seoul. The girl's name was Zuri. She was 5. Amara had adopted her 3 years ago from a foster situation in Incheon. The biological parents were unknown, but here was the part that made Seo Jin set the file down and stare at the wall for a long time. His father, Kang Myung-ho, had been sending sealed cash envelopes to Bit Nara every single month for 4 years and 7 months. No contract, no tax receipt, no organizational record. Just cash. The total? Over 300 million won, roughly 230,000 US dollars. There was no note, no explanation. And Amara Okafor had never met the elder Kang in person. She'd only ever received a single handwritten line with the first envelope, "For the children who are seen by no one." Seo Jin closed the file. His father, the man who had taught him that sentiment, was a business liability. That emotion was a crack in the armor that enemies would exploit, had been secretly funding a children's center for nearly 5 years. And he'd never said a word. But that wasn't the revelation that kept Seo Jin awake that night. There was something else in that file. A second name buried in the payment records. And when he found it, everything he thought he knew about his father's empire tilted sideways. Seo Jin didn't call ahead. That was his first mistake. He arrived at Bit Nara on a Thursday afternoon in a black sedan with tinted windows. 2 security personnel waited outside. He walked through the front door in a hand-tailored coat and found himself standing in a narrow hallway covered in children's drawings, handmade paper lanterns, and a sign in 4 languages that read, "Every child belongs." Amara was in the main room, sitting cross-legged on the floor, helping a 7-year-old boy with his Korean reading homework. She looked up, saw Seo Jin, and her expression didn't change. She didn't flinch. She didn't stand. "You can wait," she said in fluent Korean, nodding toward a small bench near the entrance. "I'll be done in 10 minutes. He waited. Kang Seo Jin, a man who made corporate presidents wait for him, sat on a children's bench for 11 minutes while Amara finished a phonics lesson. When she finally approached, she didn't extend her hand. She crossed her arms. "I know who you are," she said. "Your father funded this center." I didn't know that until his secretary sent me a funeral invitation with the Kang name on it. The envelopes never had a return address, but the timing and the amounts matched. It wasn't hard to put together. I'm grateful for that support. But I'm going to be very clear about something. That funding came with no strings. If you're here to attach strings, this conversation is already over. Seo Jin studied her. Most people looked away within 3 seconds. Amara held his gaze like she was reading a contract she intended to negotiate. "I'm not here about strings," he said. "Then why are you here?" He paused, and for the first time in a very long time, Kang Seo-jin told the truth without calculating its strategic value first. "Because a little girl held my hand, and I don't understand why." Something shifted in Amara's face. Not warmth, not yet, but the faintest crack of recognition. Like she understood what it meant for a man like him to admit he didn't understand something. "Children don't see what adults see," she said. "Zuri doesn't know who you are. She saw someone standing alone. That's all she needed to know." The room was quiet. Somewhere behind the wall, a child laughed. "You can continue your father's funding if you choose to," Amara said. "But here are my conditions. You don't visit without 48 hours' notice. You don't bring security inside this building. You don't interact with any child without my supervision. And you don't use this center, these children, or my name for any purpose, business, image, or otherwise. Are we clear?" Seo-jin almost smiled. "Almost. We're clear." And just like that, the most powerful man in Seoul was given a visitor's pass, with restrictions. Now here's where the story splits open. Remember that second name buried in the payment records? It was Hwang Tae-sung. Not as a sender, as a watcher. Tae-sung had been monitoring Myung-ho's private accounts for years through a shadow audit protocol he'd built into the Kang organization's financial infrastructure. The cash envelopes left no organizational paper trail, but the withdrawals from Myung-ho's personal accounts did. Tae-sung traced the recurring amounts, tracked the pattern, and followed the money to its destination. He knew about the payments to Bitnara. He knew about Amara. He knew about the child. And he'd been waiting for exactly this moment when Seo-jin discovered the connection, to use it. Because in Tae-sung's mind, this was ammunition. A young, untested syndicate leader developing a sentimental attachment to a foreign woman and an orphan child. That wasn't a love story. That was a vulnerability. And vulnerabilities in their world were currency. Tae-sung made his first move quietly. He contacted 3 senior members of the Kang Council, the financial committee that controlled the organization's investment flow, and scheduled a private dinner. The agenda, on paper, was succession planning. The real agenda was planting a seed. Seo-jin is distracted. Seo-jin is compromised. Seo-jin is not his father. But here's what Tae-sung didn't account for. Seo-jin had a spy on every committee. Not because he was paranoid, because his father had taught him one final lesson before they stopped speaking. Trust no one who benefits from your failure. Seo-jin knew about the dinner within 6 hours, and he didn't react. Not yet. Because Seo-jin understood something that Tae-sung never would, the most dangerous response isn't anger. It's patience. Now, let me ask you something. If you were Seo-jin, if you knew someone was building a case against you using a woman and a child you barely knew, would you walk away to protect yourself? Or would you stay knowing it made you a target? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to see what you'd choose. 3 weeks passed. Seo-jin followed every rule. He called 48 hours ahead. He left his security outside. He sat on the tiny bench and waited whenever Amara was busy. He watched her work. That was what changed him, not conversations, not grand gestures. Watching. He saw Amara break up a fight between 2 boys without raising her voice. He saw her comfort a girl who'd been called a slur at school, holding the child until the shaking stopped. He saw her manage a funding shortfall, a broken heater, and a missing volunteer in the same afternoon without once losing her composure. She ran Bitnara the way generals ran campaigns, with precision, adaptability, and an iron refusal to let anything fall through the cracks. And Zuri? Zuri treated Seo-jin like he was furniture. Familiar furniture. She'd climb onto the bench next to him, show him a crayon drawing, say something in a mix of Korean and English that he only half understood, and then wander off. No ceremony, no fear. Like he was just a person. It was disorienting, and quietly, terrifyingly, it was becoming the only part of his week he looked forward to. Then the crisis hit. Bitnara's landlord, A mid-level property developer sold the building to a Gangnam investment group. The new owners wanted the space for a commercial renovation. Amara received a 30-day eviction notice. She didn't call Seo Jin. She didn't ask for help. She started making calls to city officials, legal aid organizations, and community advocates. She filed an injunction. She organized parents. She prepared to fight. Seo Jin found out through his own channels. He sat in his office and considered his options. He could buy the building in cash within an hour. He could make the investment group disappear from the deal with a single call. He could fix this instantly. But he'd listened to Amara long enough to understand. If he overrode her agency, she'd never trust him again. This wasn't about solving her problem. It was about standing next to her while she solved it herself. So, he did something unexpected. He called his legal team and had them prepare a public interest filing, anonymously, supporting Amara's injunction on the grounds that Bitnara served a protected community function under Seoul Metropolitan Code. He provided the legal framework. She never knew where it came from. The injunction held. The eviction was suspended for 6 months. When Amara told Seo Jin the news, sitting on the floor of Bitnara while Zuri drew on his shoe with a washable marker, she was smiling. A real smile. Not wide, but present. "We got 6 months," she said. "What's the plan for month 7? He asked. She looked at him. Really looked at him. "Are you asking because you want to help? Or because you want to control the outcome?" He held her gaze. "I'm asking because I want to hear your plan. And then I want to know if there's a part of it I can support. On your terms." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said something that unlocked the second phase of access. "Okay, you can come to our strategy meetings, but you listen before you speak. And Zuri's bedtime is 7:30. If you're still around, you read her one book, and then you leave." He agreed to every condition. And that night, he read Zuri a Korean folktale about a tiger who forgot how to roar. He didn't do the voices well. Zuri corrected him twice. It was the best night he'd had in years. 2 months in, Amara invited Seo Jin to a Bitnara family dinner, a monthly tradition where children, parents, volunteers, and community members shared food from their home cultures. There was jollof rice from a Nigerian mother, japchae from a Korean grandmother, tacos from a Mexican father who ran a food truck in Itaewon, dumplings from a Chinese college student who volunteered on weekends. Seo Jin arrived and immediately understood he was out of his element. These weren't his world's negotiation tables and power dinners. There was no assigned seating. No hierarchy. A toddler threw rice at him within the first 5 minutes. Amara watched him from across the room. She was testing him, not cruelly, but necessarily. She needed to know if this man could exist in a space where he didn't control anything, where he wasn't feared, where he was just another adult eating dinner with children. An older Korean woman, Mrs. Park, a grandmother who volunteered at Bitnara, sat next to Seo Jin. She looked at him for a long moment. "You look like your father," she said quietly in Korean. Seo Jin's hand tightened around his chopsticks. "You knew him?" "He came here once, 3 years ago. He didn't tell anyone his name. He just watched the children play. Then he sat right where you're sitting and cried." She paused. "I didn't ask why. Some things don't need explanations. They just need witnesses." Seo Jin didn't speak for a long time after that. Later that evening, after the dinner wound down and most families had gone home, Amara found Seo Jin sitting alone in the hallway outside Bitnara's main room. Zuri was asleep on a mat inside. Amara sat beside him. Not close, but present. "You stopped talking 2 hours ago," she said. "That's unusual. You normally stop talking after 45 minutes. He almost laughed. "You track how long I talk?" "I track everything. It's how I keep people safe." Silence. Then Seo Jin spoke, and what came out was the most honest thing he'd said in maybe a decade. "I didn't speak to my father for 2 years before he died. He asked me to take over the organization when I was 32. I said no. He said I had no choice, that blood was the only loyalty that couldn't be bought. I told him that if that were true, then he had already bought mine by giving me no other option. We never spoke again." He looked at his hands. The same hands a little girl had reached for at a funeral. "I hated him for making me into something I didn't choose. And now I find out he was secretly funding a place like this. A place full of everything he never gave me. Warmth, belonging, choice. His voice was low, controlled, but cracking at the edges. I don't know if he was trying to make up for what he did to me, or if he was just a more complicated man than I was willing to see. Amara was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was steady but gentle. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive, Seojin. People can be the worst thing that happened to you, and still carry good inside them. The hard part isn't figuring out which one is true. The hard part is accepting that both things are true at the same time. He looked at her, and in that hallway, under the fluorescent light of a community center in Mapo-gu, the most feared man in Seoul let someone see the wound he'd been hiding behind 12 years of ice. She didn't try to fix it. She just stayed. Hwang Tae-sung was patient. But patience without action becomes irrelevance, and he knew it. He made his move on a Tuesday. First, he leaked a carefully edited dossier to 3 members of the Kang Council. The dossier contained photographs of Seojin entering and leaving Bitnara, timestamps of his visits, and a profile of Amara that emphasized one word over and over again: foreign. In the world of Seoul's elite power structures, the implication was poison. A syndicate leader spending unreported time with a foreign woman and an adopted child wasn't just gossip, it was a signal. It said, he's vulnerable, he's distracted, he's compromising the brand. Second, Tae-sung contacted the investment group that owned Bitnara's building. He offered to privately finance the full commercial renovation on one condition: accelerate the eviction, overrule the injunction, close the center within 30 days. Third, and this was the move that showed his real intelligence, he arranged for a city health inspector to visit Bitnara unannounced. The inspector found 3 minor violations that had existed for years but were never enforced. A faulty exit sign, a kitchen faucet with low water pressure, an expired fire extinguisher in the storage room. Individually, nothing. Together, with the right pressure applied to the right municipal office, enough to trigger a temporary closure. Amara received the closure notice on a Friday afternoon. She stood in the empty main room of Bitnara, holding the notice, and for the first time in Seojin's presence, she looked shaken. Not broken, but shaken. "They're shutting us down," she said. 14 days, pending remediation and reinspection. She didn't cry. She sat down. She pulled out her laptop, and she started building a plan. But here's what Tae-sung didn't know. Seojin had already been 3 steps ahead. Because while Tae-sung was building his trap, Seojin was building something far more dangerous, a legal case that would end Tae-sung's career without a single act of violence. Seojin didn't raise his voice. He didn't make threats. He didn't send men. He sent lawyers. Over the previous 2 months, quietly, methodically, Seojin had instructed Director No to audit every financial pathway Tae-sung had touched in the last decade. Not the clean records. The shadow ledger, the one Tae-sung thought only he knew about. The audit revealed over 7 billion won in misrouted funds. Investment accounts that existed on paper, but dissolved upon inspection. Shell companies registered in Busan and Singapore that funneled organization money into Tae-sung's personal holdings. SEO Jin had the evidence notarized, sealed, and held. He didn't release it to the council. Not yet. Instead, he did something that made Amara look at him differently. He called a meeting, not with Tae-sung, but with the city's municipal oversight board. In that meeting, through his legal team, Seojin presented documentation that Bitnara served as a registered community welfare site under Metropolitan Code, which granted it protected status from commercial eviction and gave it priority access to municipal remediation support. The health violations were fixed within 3 days. The closure was reversed. The eviction was blocked permanently. And Seojin's name appeared nowhere in the filing. When Amara found out, not from him, but from her own lawyer, who recognized the legal strategy, she called Seojin. "You did this. Your lawyer did this. I just made sure the legal framework was available." "Don't play word games with me, Seojin. You protected Bitnara." "No," he said. "I protected the place where a little girl corrects my reading voice. There's a difference." She was quiet. Then, "Come to dinner on Saturday, at my apartment. Zuri wants to show you her new drawing, and She paused. "I want you to see where we live, on my terms. Phase 4, unlocked. Not with power, not with money, with patience, and the discipline to help without controlling." Saturday dinner at Amara's apartment in Mapogu was small. 2 bedrooms, warm light. Zuri's drawings taped to every wall. The kitchen smelled like suya spice and sesame oil, a collision of cultures that somehow worked. Zuri made Seo-jin sit on the floor and drew his portrait. It looked nothing like him. He told her it was perfect. But the evening was interrupted. A message arrived on Seo-jin's phone. From Tai-sung. 2 words and a photograph. The photograph was of Amara's apartment building, taken from across the street. That afternoon, the 2 words, "Beautiful family." Seo-jin's blood ran cold. Not with fear, with a fury so controlled it was nearly invisible. He looked at Amara across the room. She was helping Zuri wash paint off her hands, singing something softly in Yoruba. He could leave, walk away, cut this connection before it became a weapon that Tai-sung could swing. That was the strategic choice, the safe choice, the choice his father would have made. But Seo-jin was not his father, and he was done letting fear make his decisions. The next morning, Seo-jin called an emergency session of the full Kang Council, all 12 members. He stood at the head of the table in the Kang Tower boardroom and laid out Tai-sung's entire financial fraud scheme. Every shell company, every misrouted one, every forged signature. Then he did something no one expected. He disclosed his connection to Bitnara, publicly, to the entire council. "My father funded a children's community center for nearly 5 years, Seo-jin said. "I've continued that commitment. The center is run by a woman named Amara Okafor, and she has more integrity in her smallest decision than most of us have shown in our entire careers. Hwang Tai-sung attempted to destroy that center, not because it threatened the organization, but because he believed my involvement with it made me weak." He looked around the room. Every eye was on him. "Let me be clear. Protecting people who cannot protect themselves is not weakness. Hiding behind stolen money and surveillance photographs, that is weakness. And it ends today." Tae-sung was removed from the council within the hour. His assets were frozen. His access was revoked. No violence, no bloodshed, just strategy, patience, and paperwork. The most powerful takedown in the Kang organization's history, and it was done with a filing cabinet. 3 months later. Bitnara held its annual community festival. Paper lanterns hung from the trees in the courtyard. Children ran between food stalls. Korean grandmothers taught Nigerian mothers how to fold dumplings, and a Mexican father showed a group of teenagers how to make salsa while K-pop played from a Bluetooth speaker someone had duct-taped to a basketball hoop. Seo-jin arrived without security. He wore a simple navy jacket. No entourage, no black sedan. Zuri spotted him from across the courtyard and ran, full sprint, arms out, braids flying, and crashed into his legs with enough force to make him stumble. He picked her up. She put a paper crown on his head. It was lopsided and covered in glitter. Amara watched from the doorway, and when Seo-jin looked at her, across the courtyard, over Zuri's shoulder, she didn't look away. She walked toward him, slowly, not with the guarded composure of their first meetings, not with the careful distance of a woman still deciding. She stopped in front of him. Zuri, still in his arms, put one hand on each of their faces and said, "My people." Amara looked at Seo-jin. "You earned this," she said quietly. "Not with money, not with power, with time, and consistency, and showing up even when I made it hard." "You should have made it harder," he said. She smiled. "Oh, I will." He reached out and took her hand. The same hand he'd learned to offer without expectation. The same hand a 5-year-old girl had taught him to open. And in a courtyard in Mapogu, surrounded by the sound of children laughing in 6 different languages, the man who once made a room of 63 men go silent stood still. Not because people feared him, but because, for the first time in his life, he had a reason to stay. Remember the girl in the white dress? The one who walked through the silence and held a stranger's hand? She wasn't brave because she didn't know who he was. She was brave because she saw who he could be. And that right there, is the thing that no amount of power, money, or fear can give you. Someone who sees the version of you that you haven't become yet, and reaches for it anyway. If this story moved you, if you felt something shift in your chest right now, then you belong here. Subscribe to A Korean Mafia Boss, hit that bell, and leave a comment telling me what moment broke you. Was it Zori taking his hand? Was it the hallway confession? Was it the paper crown? Tell me, because I read every single one. And I'll see you in the next story.